Welcome back. In our last class, we were able to implement our Eureka server, and then we were able to, of course, deploy it to Docker. In the last class too, we were able to create just the authorization and authentication service. We just created the project and make sure it's connected to the Eureka server or it registers on the Eureka server. Now in this class, what we want to do is we want to create our authentication service to make sure that we're able to register and log in. That's what we'll be doing in this class. So let's get right into it. But first, let me explain what of course, the authentication service and the authorization service will do. Before we dive right into it, I would like to iterate that authorization and authentication server is a very complex topic, and it's time consuming also, right? There are a lot of different ways you could do this. You could use Keycloak, you could use Okta, depending on what you're doing and your requirement. But I just want us to use authorization service so we know what goes on behind the scene of the authorization. Okay. Again, do not forget the aim of this video or the series of this video is making sure that we have a lot of microservices working as one unit. All right, let's get right into it. Going by this simple flow, we have the authentication and the authorization, right? So let's explain the authentication first. The authentication, we have, of course, the client, the operation, and the Auth Server. Now, the client is anything that is trying to get access to the system, of course, like the mobile app or maybe the web app. Now, the client makes a post call. We have different HTTP calls, as I've said in previous classes, the post, get, and delete. But in this case, we are doing a post, and then it sends a post call to the login endpoint. And what it sends is the username and the password. And then it sends it to the authorization server. And the authorization server, the job of the authorization server is to make sure and validate that the username and the password for the login is correct. And when it's able to validate that, it then comes back with a token. It generates an access token and then sends back that access token to the client so the client can use it. Now, when you then want to make a call to, in our case, would of course be creating an expense tracker. When you then want to make a call to the expense tracker, it sends that particular token through the header, right? And sends it to, say, our expense tracker. And then the expense tracker tries to check if that particular user has the authorization to make those calls. And if it does, it then returns the data. I'm just going to try to make sure it's simple and we're not going to make it too complex. Again, the aim of this video is to make sure that all the applications talk to themselves, or all the microservices talk to themselves. I want to have a seamless call between a lot of applications, and we're able to redirect them using the API gateway. All right, let's get right into it. So the first thing we want to do is we want to check our pom.xml. And of course, we already understand what this pom.xmls mean. But what we want to do here is just want to check what dependencies we have and what more we need. And of course, again, we'll be using a Postgres, right? So we need dependency for Postgres. We would also be using Hibernate in this case. We're just going to make this as simple as it could be, as easy as it could be. All right. So let's just look for we already have the web, we have the Netflix, the Eureka to connect it to Eureka. Of course, we have the test, just in case we want to write our unit test. And so the next one we need would be, since we are writing an authorization, so let's do a Spring security. I want to do a security. Okay. And then we want to do Spring. Starter security. Let me see if that's here. There you go. Yep. Okay. So the next one we need the JPA, as I said earlier. So we do Spring starter JPA. There you go. Okay. Let's index that. Then we need Postgres. definitely. And then let's just add one more. I like to use Lombok. So I do okay. So that's it. All right. That's for now. As I said earlier, we just want to make it as simple as it could be. All right. So that's all dependencies we need for now. And then, all right. So let's jump into the implementation. The first thing we want to do is just create our model package. Let's create a package for it, and then we'll create our entity. Fair enough. And then, of course, from our Lombok, let's just shoot the add data, which is okay. Again, there's a lot of ways to do this, right? But let's just leave it the way it is. Then we want to do our at entity. Let's just do at entity because we want to save it in the database. Then we also need the table name, right? Let's just name it a table name. All right. Let's just create constructors. All our constructors. Okay, good. All right. Then we need our ID, right? Our ID. So let's just make our ID a long. Let's make it a long. Non-null. All right. And then we want to make it auto-generated. And the strategy would be generated type identity. Good. All right. So we have the ID. All right. So the next thing we want is, of course, we want the username and the password, right? Which is what the users will be using to log in. So in this case, we just want to do private string username. Okay. Should it be nullable? No, it cannot be null. So let's just do this. Nullable equals false. All right. So let's do password too. Again, I'm just making this as simple as it could be. So there's a lot of ways you could do this. Okay. So the next one will be, let's assume we want to save the first name and the last name too. Shall we make it nullable too? It should not be null, right? So nullable is false. So let's just copy this to make it faster. And then we just make this last name. Okay. All right. So one more thing, I think we can also do the rows. Yep. Let's just create rows. Let's create rows. Assuming that the person has like a user role and admin role. So let's just do rows. All right. Okay. The rows could be null. All right. We could just make that null. Okay. So that's that for the user entity. All right, so let's now create, let's create a repository. Let's jump onto creating a repository, right? The repository is definitely what is used to connect to the database. Now, let me just go back to this and explain this one line by line so you understand what this is all about, okay? So this data is, of course, generated by Lombok. And now what it does is the data annotation itself generates the getters and setters. So for example, if I go to another class and do last name, or if I just do user entity dot get, if I do not have their data there, or at setter or at getter, I mean the getters and the setters, I would not be able to access this last name. So the data here does that for me. it gives me that privilege to use the @getters and @setters. All right. Now at entity here, what the @entity does, it marks the class as a JPA entity, meaning it will be mapped to a table in the database. That's what this does. It helps to map this to a table in the database. Simply explained. All right. So the noag constructor also pretty much is also from the Lumber, right? The Lumber family. And what it does is it generates a no argument constructor, which is required by, of course, JPA for creating instances, right? And all arg constructor does the opposite of no arg. It generates a constructor with all the fields. And of course, I've explained what a constructor is in previous classes, right? And one more is the table. The table annotation maps, of course, the entity to a specific database table. In this case, the user table, right? All right. So it's as simple as that, what this does. And of course, there's the ID annotation. So there's a lot of annotations here. The ID annotation, it marks the ID as the primary key for this particular table. So if I want to, for example, if you go into the database and you're looking for the primary key, the ID just tells the table that, okay, the database, that this particular field or this particular field here is my primary key. And of course, the @column annotation maps the field to the database, simply put. All right. And then we understand all what the fields are. Okay. So now let's jump into the user. Let's just go into creating the repository class. All right. So let's just create our user repository. Good. So when creating our repository, we need, it should be an interface, not a class. First off, we need to extend the JPA repository. And what JPA repository is? JPA repository is a Spring data interface that provides many methods. So in this particular repository, there are many methods for like communicating with the database. So you'd understand what I'm trying to say. So for example, I need to extend this, which is the JPA repository. There you go. So this is it. And in this case, if you go inside JPA repository, for example, let's just go into it. You see that there is okay, just so you're wondering how did I do that, you on your keyboard just hold on the Control key and then you click on it, right? So if you go in it, there is a lot of method in it. You have the delete in batch, delete batch, the get one, get by, and a lot of things or a lot of methods you can use to communicate with the database. All right. So here in our case, we want to make sure that it is attached to a particular object, which is in our case is the user entity object, right? And our ID is long. Okay. Okay. All right. So one more thing we're missing is, of course, the @repository annotation. And what that annotation does is the annotation tells Spring that this interface we just created is a repository. And of course, repositories are responsible for interacting with the database. Simply put, it helps us to perform the CRUD operation. And what is the CRUD operation? When I say the CRUD operation, it simply means CRUD, right? The CRUD operation is just the create, read, update, and delete operations, right? All right. So that is that for the repository. Now let us create our Spring configuration. As I said earlier, I'll try to make it as simple as it could be. All right. So let's just create a package for security, and then we create our Spring config. Security config. Sorry. Good. I know it's a class. But first, let's quickly create our custom user detail service, right? And what it does, it is required for loading user information during authentication, right? So let's just create that service, and then let's create that service first, and then we call it, let's just call it custom user detail service. All right, just name it that, and then we did an annotation here for at service. All right, so what that annotation simply says is it tells Spring to manage this class as a service, meaning it can be injected into other parts of the application. It can actually be used in other parts of the application. All right, so let's just keep going. And then the first thing we want to do is call our repository class, since we will be getting and fetching the users from our database, which means whenever we do a call, a post, we want to get the token, and it goes into the database and check if that user is available, right? So we need our user repository in here, so we need to inject it. All right, so how do you do that? You just go in there and do a user repository, because we already created it, remember? So you just name it repository, and then to inject it you need an auto wired. Simple. So it's injected. Now, so here we want to implement, as I said earlier, it implements user detail service, which is of course an interface from Spring that loads user specific data from authentication. All right, so let's just implement user detail service. Okay, so it's gonna bring in, from the last class I explained overriding and overloading, method overriding and overloading. In this case, it's gonna come up with the overriding method. So let's just implement it. You have the load user by username. Yep, that's what we want. And then we want to tell it what to do. All right, so the first thing we want to tell it to do is whenever a call is made, just get me my users, our user entity, and then we want to call our repository dot. Now, as I said earlier, the repository has a lot of methods in it, right? So we can do find by username, for example. Okay, you know what, let's just go back into the repository to create a find by. Okay, you can just create a find by username. In this case, we just do we do optional, or do we just let's make it optional. All right, so all right, then we have user entity. Good. And then in this case, we want to do find by username. Okay. And then we want to pass in the string of the username here. Good. That solves it. So let's go back to the user detail service, and then we want to do and find by username. Awesome. And then we want to pass in our username, right? So where is that username coming from? The username is definitely coming from here. Then we'll just pass it in. Okay, so this is going to be an optional. We're making it optional. Good. That solves it. Which means it's going to go into the database to find the user. All right. You know what? Let's just make this the user. Let's not make this optional. Just to we can just to make it simple, or else throw, and then if it doesn't find the user in there, so what should it do? So we want to throw something here. We just tell it to throw new user not found exception. Simple. User not found. Simple. It's as simple as that. All right, now that we have this, the next thing is to return. So what do we want to return? We want to return a new Spring Core user. All right, and in this case we want to pass in our username. We want to pass in our password. Good. And then we want to also pass in our rows, because we assume that the rows are more than one, so we just want to do arrays dot stream and stream it, and then we want to pass in our user role, get role, let's let's get our row. Awesome. And then we want to split it. As I said earlier, we believe that the role is more than one, so we just split. All right. So after that, we then want to map it to the Spring simple granted authority. I'll explain what that is. So let's just do a map. Okay. And then we want to collect it to a list. Awesome. That's it. So let's go back what we've done again. So the first thing we did was to use the annotation at service. And what that does, it tells the Spring to manage this class as a service, meaning it can be injected in all other parts of the application, right? And so we also have we created a custom service, user service, detail service, which implements the user detail service. And what that does, it's simple. This particular service implements, of course, this, and the user service is required for loading information during authentication, and that's why we need this class, right? So the next one is of course the user repository, which is of course interaction with the database. We created this just for interaction with the database, and of course we have the @AutoWired. The @AutoWired automatically injects the user repository. What do I mean by inject? It brings everything that the user repository has and brings it here, so we'll be able to use it, right? And so the next one is of course the code itself, the implementation itself. Now this particular code is having an override, right? Which means it's coming from the user detail service. I explained what overriding and overloading is from the previous class, all right? So if you don't understand that, you can go back to the previous class and you'll be able to understand what method overloading and overriding is, all right? So what this is doing is simple, right? This line, let's pick it line by line. For example, this line, what this line is doing is it queries the database for a user by, of course, the username. And then we created this particular find by username in the repository class. So what it does is it finds by that username. And if the username is there, it of course returns it. But if it's not found, it then returns, throws the not found exceptions. But if it is there, what it does is, okay, I want to return a new instance of the Spring user, and it takes certain arguments: the username, the password, and of course the row. And what this does is it's pretty much a constructor, right? So this constructor takes 3 arguments definitely and maps it to this simple granted authority. And the simple granted authority is a list or an array of rows that a user can actually have. And then what it does is then gets and puts it into a list, because if you go into this user, you would notice that this user takes, a collection. So collection, a list, right? So that's why we have to pass it into a list anyways. All right. So the next thing is, let's now go back to our security config. So the first thing we want to do here is annotate this particular class at a configuration class using @configuration, right? And what that does is it just tells Spring that this class provides configuration settings. Simple. All right. So then the next thing we want to do is we want to inject the customer detail service we just created. All right. So how do you do that? Just inject it using, let's use a constructor method. Okay. And then you can just hover over it and then add as constructor. That's fine, to make our job easy. And then the next thing we want to do is we want to implement a security filter chain, right? And what that does is the method defines the security rules for the application. That's what it does, and it returns a security filter chain bin, right? So we need to create that as a bin. So we'll make that a bin, and then we'll make it public security filter chain. Good. We just name a security filter chain. All right. So we're going to pass in an argument to it, and it's going to be an HTTP security. Good. Just name it HTTP. That's fine. And then from there, the next thing we want to do is we want to just declare certain settings for this particular application. One of them is the cross-site request forgery. Of course, we want to disable it because it's common in it's commonly done in stateless JWT based applications. So we want to make sure we disable it. So how to do that is just do an http.csrf, and then we can just do csrf, and then we use the lambda sign, and then csrf.disable. That should do it. And then if you overwrite it, should probably tell you an exception. So all right, let's just add the exception. Let's just throw the exception, which is, we can go further by throwing specific exceptions, but as I said earlier, I want to make it as fast and easy as it could be. All right, so the next thing is we want to allow requests to all endpoints that start with an auth, because we'll be using auth. Let's just do that. All right, so we just want to do authorization request, and then we want to just name it auth, then auth dot, what do we want to do? Request matcher. Okay, so request matchers, and then we want to do everything that start with auth. All right, so let's just permit is permitted. Good. So the next thing is we want to make sure that all other endpoints apart from the auth or anything that starts with auth, we want to make sure that everything is actually secured here. So let's just bring it here. Any request dot authenticated. Okay, the next thing we want to do is, because right now if we leave this like this and try to run it or try to build it, it's gonna show us a form for username and password. So we want to disable that and use our own private username and password. We want to make sure that our own username and password actually is what we want to use. So we don't just want to show the Spring form. So how do you do that? We just come here and then we do a dot form login, and so we want to disable that. Let's just disable like doing this. All right, so that should do the job for us. And then we want to build it. Let's just do the build. Awesome. Oh, you know what? Let's just return it. Let's just return the build rather than just declaring it. Okay, so let's go over this again. What we've done here. So what we've done here is we created a bean, and what this bean does is this bean returns a security filter chain, and it takes an argument of the HTTP security, and then of course we're then doing, okay, we want to disable the CSRF, as I said earlier, is a cross-site request forgery, and it's an attack. All right, so we want to disable that, and then how to disable that is just doing a csrf.disable, and then also we want to permit all endpoints or all calls that starts with the prefix auth. All right, so we want to make sure that we allow those ones and we permit all, and then we disable everything that, or we do not permit all that is not auth. All right, so we make sure that they are authenticated, and again we are saying we want to disable the form logins, and that's the default form that is made by Spring. All right, and then we return an http.build. Simple as that. All right, so one more thing we need to do here, or certain more things we need to do definitely, and one of them is returning because we will be encoding or encrypting our passwords. All right, so we need a bean of the password encoder. All right, so how do you do that? We just do a public password encoder. Just use the, you can use this. Let's say password encoder. Okay, and then we'll want to return new bcrypt password encoder. Simple. All right, so the next thing we want to do is we want to create a JWT encoder, and what it does is it helps to load the RSA keys that will be used for signing our JWT token. Right, I would also show you how to load those keys in a minute, but let's just do this. All right, so we of course create a bin, and then we make it public, and then JWT encoder is what we want. All right, let's just make a JWT encoder. Let's import that. Good. And then we just want to load our RSA keys, as I said earlier, right? So the first thing you want to do is do the RSA and key. All right. Then we want to do RSA key. Then we want to load the key. You know what? Let's just create another method here to load the key, just so we don't have everything in a method. All right. So RSA key, all right, and let's name it load RSA key. And then what we want to do is we want to go into the key store. To do the keystore.get instance of, we want to get instance of jks. I'll explain it in a minute. Then we want to do the keystore dot, then we want to load the new instance of the path, because we want to get the path of the file itself. All right, so we would create that in a minute. So new class So then let's just create the path for that key store, right? So let's just name this key store path. All right, there'll be an error here because I do not have it yet. So then let's just get the input stream because we want to read it, right? And then we also want to create the password for it. So key store password. So I said earlier, we just make it as simple as it could be. All right, so let's just make this to character. All right, good. So now let's go back to create this two here. So we'll just be calling it from our application, application.yaml. So let's just create the value for it. We'll come back to that and then we read it from there, okay? So the first thing we want to do is create a value, and then you do private string keypass, for example. Then we can just replicate this, then go back and copy this, make this a string. Awesome. Okay, all right, so here we want a value for both. Then we want to read those files from that. We'll come back to this in a minute, okay? So but we already have this, and then let's just throw the exceptions. I have exceptions here and the exceptions. Okay, so good. 3 exceptions. Let's use that. Okay, so we have all the exceptions thrown. That's fine. All right, so after that, what then do we want to do? We want to receive it. Let's just load what we've received, and then we do RSA public key. That's what we want. Equals keystore dot get certificate, and then we need the alias, right? So we skip this for now, and then we do get public key. All right, so it's gonna complain here. So what we can do is we can just cast it. Let's cast it. That solves our issue. So let's go back and create our key. All right, let's go back and create our JKS key. All right, so how do you do that? I have a file here that gives you how to do this, and I'm going to explain this. Of course, it goes into the keytool and generate what we need to do is generate the pair, and we have an alias here. The alias is the Auth Server. Of course, we have the algorithms here, the RSA algorithms, and we have the key size. The algorithm is RSA. The key size is 2048. You can read more about this, and then we have the store type, which is JKS, and that's what we will do here. We need the store type here. We already have the store type. Okay, yeah, there you go. So this is the store type. We already called it here as JKS, which is good. And then the file we'll be creating will be keystore.jks, and the validity is 3650. All right, and then we create a store password as password, and we create a key password as password, so you can change all this yourself. And we have the CN, of course, as the Auth Server. We have the OU organization unit as OAuth. We have the organization as company, and then we have the location, which is the city, and then you have the state and the country. All right, so you could change all these things yourself, but for me, I'm just going to keep it simple like this and copy and paste. I'll put this in the description link so you could use this. And so I'm just going to run this, just copy and paste it, and it should create my file. Let's see, let's refresh this, and then there you go. So just drag this and drop it in the resource folder. That's fine. And then we already know what we used here. So first of our alias, let's just copy our alias somewhere here. This is our alias. All right, let's copy that and put it here. Okay, and then we already know the path to our file. It's in the resource folder. So to get to that, all you need to do is just do the $, and then let's go and declare the path here. You can always make the path whatever you want, so I'm just gonna make mine key store, and then path. Just make the path key store, since I'm reading from the resource file, jks. And then of course my password from here, we just made the password, right? So easy enough. We need password and password. Simple. Just let's leave that as simple as it is, and then we can use this. Okay, so we have the path to be keystore.path, and then we have the password to be keystore.password. All right, so let's go back there and fix that. So the path is keystore.path, and then the password is keystore.password. You can always change this. Again, you can always change it for your own use case. Okay, that solves that. So let's go back to continue what we're doing. So we already got the file, and we're reading the file line by line. And the next thing is we want to get the private key. All right, let's get the private key by doing RSA private key equals dot get key. And then we also want to get this. Let's just get the password again. All right, keys the password dot to character array. All right, that works. And then what do we want to return here? There's an error here, so we can always hover over this. Then we need to, it says required the RSA private key, but what we are sending is the key. We can always cast it. All right, there's an error here, typo error. Let's fix that. So what do we want to return? We want to return new RSA key. Okay, dot builder, let's build it. Then we want to pass in our public key. All right, then the private key, then the key ID, and the key ID, which is the Auth Server. And then we want to do a build. Oh, there's an error here. Yeah, that's because this is private key and not public key. Awesome. Good. So fixed. All right. All right. So let's go back to this, and then we return an instance of this again. All right. So let's just do load this key. Okay. So this looks good, and then we want to hover over this and just return the exceptions. That works. And then the next thing we want to do is create our JWT source, which holds the RSA key. And how to do that is we want to do a JWT source, and then we want to do a security context. Let's use the proc, and then just name it JWT source, which is equal to, and then we want to create our selector and then our context. So we just want to do our JWT selector and security context. That works. This works, but I do not like this. All right, good. So then we use the lambda sign, and then we return the JWT selector dot select, and then we want to return the new instance of the JWT set, which is good. And then we want to pass in our RSA key. Awesome. Awesome. Then finally we want to return new Nimbus encoder, and then we want to pass in our source. Simple. That ends that. Okay, good. Awesome. Then one last thing we need to do here is to create our authentication manager. All right, the authentication manager, what it does, it uses the existing authentication configuration from Spring to provide this functionality. All right, so let's just create that, another bean, and then we'll make it public, and then authentication manager. And we return authentication manager dot get authentication manager. Simple. And then let's just do this and run and import the exceptions. Good. All right, so now we're done with the security configurations. So the next thing we want to do is let's try to create our service class where we would use for registering, where our business logic is going to be sitting. Of course, we use that for registering, and we use it for logging in. So let's just, we already have a service. Good. So let's just do this new class. Let's just name it service implementation. Let's name it service implementation. That's fine. All right, so we put this to at service. Good. And then the first thing we want to do is we want to register first, right? So let's just create our registration first, and we can just do a public. Let's create a public class. Let's return a string. All right, let's just return a string, and then we just want to name it register user. Okay, and then what does this accept? Let's just accept the entity itself, which is the user entity, and we call it user. That's fine. And then the first thing we want to do is we want to check if the user you're trying to register is already in the database. And before you can do that, you need to inject the repository. If you remember, the repository is what we use to interact with the database. So we already created our user repository, and then we just name that user repository. That's fine. Awesome. So to do that, then we then come here and to do that, we just do a user dot find by, and then we get the username from the user. Good. And so what is this? It says it's an optional, so we can change this to an optional. That's fine. And then we want to do, if it is already in the database, what do you want to do? So we want to do if user dot is present, and then we want to return, let's just return a string, user name already taken, right? Simple. Let's just make it simple. But if it's not, then what do we want to do? What we want to do is we first want to encode our password, right? So, and you know, from the security config, we already have something to a bin of the password encoder. So we just need to call in the password encoder here to help us encode our password. And how do you do that? You do the auto-wired again, auto-wired, and then you pass in the private instance of the password encoder. All right, let's make this private too. Which is good. Okay, so then we want to set our password, right? So how do you do that? We just need to do user, which is this user here. Do a user dot set password, password encoder dot encode user dot get password. Simple. And then again, there's a lot of ways to do in this, right? But in this case, we just want to set the role also. Let's just set the role as, let's add code it, the set role. Let's just name this user role user. Let's just do that. A user role. That's good. And then we want to save this, which is the user repository dot save. Then we want to save the user. Good. And then after that, what do we want to return? We want to return a string, right? User registered successfully. Awesome. All right, so we're done with the registration method or implementation. The next one is, let's just log in. Let's create the login too. Simple. Let's just create the login, then move into that public. And for the login, we want to return, let's just return a string. You know what? Let's return a map. Let's return a map. So you'll understand why in a minute. So string, then want to return object. Okay. So that's how to return a map, actually. All right. So in this case, what do we want to do? This has to take two things also. It has to take the username and the password, right? So let's just pass it in straight. Username, and then string of password. Simple. All right. So what then do we want to do if it is present? The first thing we want to do is we want to check first off if it is present. If it is not, then we just throw the user is not present, right? So let's just first search the database for that particular user. Again, let's just copy this, and so it's easy for us. Let's just copy this, and then we want to dump this here. So we want to just check the username. Good. All right, and then we want to do if the user is not present in this case, right? So present, then we want to return, let's just return the map of status, right? So let's just add this. work. Okay, and so we want to return, we just want to do this, we just want to say let's add to the response dot put status. Then we want to add user not found. Simple. And then we want to return the response. We can just return the response directly, it doesn't really matter also. Anyways, all right, so that should return user not found, definitely. All right, so but what if it's in the database? Then the next thing we want to do is just do a string. Then we want to get our access token, right? Now, how do we generate the access token? Let's create a method here that does the generation of the access token. All right, and so of course what it gets is it gets the users. Let me just do user entity user, and then we want to pass in authentication. Authentication, and then we want to pass in how long do we want the token to last for. So we do a long expiry duration. All right, then first let's just declare an instant, which is pretty much a time. All right, instant is imported. Now, after that, we want to do our JWT claims. Then we want to get our claims. And let's build it. All right. So what do we want to add into it? We want to add the issuer. And then our issuer will be, let's just name it anything, issuer, all right? And the next thing we want to add is what time was it issued? Issued at when? And then that should be now, right? It was issued now. And then the next thing we want to add is when is it going to expire? And then we want to add our expiration, right? So the next thing we want to add is the subject, right? This should be the expiration. Now let's do now plus. Let's add it to now plus expiration, all right? Plus seconds expiration, good. Because this is long, so we have to add it as a seconds. Okay, that's good. So the next thing will be the subject. Let's make it dot get name, that works. Then the next is let's add our rows, right? Let's just add claim. These are more things you can add. So in this place you can add whatever again you want, anything you want to add to it. So let's do authentication dot get authorities dot to string. Then the next thing is since I have name in there, let me just add name too. Let me just add first name, for example. And then I can always get that name from the user entity dot get first name. Good. And then we want to build this. Let's just build this. Awesome. Okay. So what do we want to return? Remember, we created our bin for the JWT to encode. All right. So we just bring in. Let's auto-wire the bin also. Let's auto-wire the JWT encoder also. Alright, so let's do JWT encoder. Alright, so what we want to return here, we want to return the JWT encoder. Encoding from the claim set, and then we're getting the token dot token value. Okay, awesome. So here, since we're doing this, so what do we want to return here? We want to return something, right? Good. Awesome. So if we come back here, so the next thing we want to do, if it is present, right, we then want to return that particular token. All right, so how do you do that? We can do generate token, and then we pass in our user entity, we pass in our authentication. We do not have authentication set yet, so we can always create that. And how do you do that? We bring in our authentication manager. If you remember, we created also a bin for that authentication manager. And how do you do that? Authentication manager is authentication equals, again, let's go, let's auto-wire the authentication manager also. So auto-wired authentication manager, good, that's good. So let's go use it. So we have the authentication manager dot authenticate, then want to do new, because we're using username password authentication token, which is good. And then we want to pass in our username, then we want to pass in our password. Okay, username and password, good. So we're good. So now we can pass in the authentication here. And then we have one more, which is the expiry, right? So let's just make it 1 hour. Okay. So then we pass this in here. And then this is giving us an error here. It says we have an optional. So let's just do .get. That works. That fixes it. Okay, awesome. That works. And then we should return a map. So let's create our map. Oh, we already have the map created. So what we want to then put in there is we want to put in the response map dot put. The first thing we want to put is our access token. And the next thing is how long does it take to expire, right? You can always create a variable for that, but for this we just encode it because we already know we're making it 1 hour, which is 3,600 seconds, right? So let's just add response dot put expires in 3600. Good. So here we'll then want to return the response. Simple. All right. Okay, so now that we're done with the service class, looks like there's an error somewhere. Just look at that. Okay, the new. All right, let's take that out. Okay, good. Now the next thing is to create the controller. The controller is going to be handling our HTTP methods. All right, so let's just do that. Let's create that quickly. All right. There seems to be an error somewhere here. Where is that? Oh, okay. Yep. Good. All solved. Alright, so controllers, the new, let's just name it user controller. Awesome. And then the first annotation you need here is, of course, definitely the @REST controller, because we're dealing with REST controllers. And what that annotation does is pretty much marks this class as the Spring controller that handles RESTful web services. That's what it does. All right. So the next thing we want to do is we want to add at request mapping is specify the base URL that we want to use. If you remember from the service config, security config, we already said something about the base URL, which is the auth. So we can go back there and just do at request mapping, which is our auth. Anything out that begins with the auth, we want to allow it. All right. So now we have the controller class created. So the first thing we want to do is, of course, inject our user class or service class or the service implementation we just created. So to do that, at autowired, as we've been doing, and then we just implement, we just pretty much do a private user implementation, service implementation. All right, this name is service. That's it. All right, so now to use this, first of all, we need to register, right? So we will be creating a post endpoint for registration, and how do you do that? Just a post mapping. And then what endpoint do you want to call it? You want to call it /register. All right, so public, let's return a response entity. Let's return a response entity, and we return it in any type. When you say question mark, it means it can take a generic type, any type, right? So let's just name it register user, and then we want to use the @request body. And what this does is it tells Spring to convert the incoming JSON body of the HTTP request into a user entity object. All right, so you would understand what I'm trying to say in a minute. So let's just do this user entity and then user. Okay, so again, what this does is it says, okay, I am sending a JSON. You would understand when we start sending the data, I'm sending a JSON. Just change that particular JSON into this object, but you will understand it now. All right, so after that, what we want to do is then we want to call our service implementation, right? So first off, let's see, we want to do service dot, we want to register, right? So we're passing our user. Okay, but let's not forget this particular user, the register user, is returning a string. So to return that, we can just do return response entity dot. Okay, again, as I said earlier, I'm just making this as simple as it could be. All right, so we just understand it. Let's first try this. Again, to try this, we use our postman, right? Remember from the last time we tried using our postman. And so we register that. Let's just register. And let's run this. Let's just spin up. Again, so let's look at what this is expecting. It's expecting the username, the password, the first name, the last name, and the rows, right? Okay, so we have an error. Good. It says there's no data source. Good. So we have to go to our YAML file and declare where our how it talks to our database. All right, so we haven't done that, so let's quickly do that. And how to do that is also simple. We want to do a data source. Data source. Good. And then the data source here, we want to do our URL because we are using Postgres. So we have a JDBC Postgres, and then we're using a local host. So yeah, that's fine. Localhost. And then our port is 5432. So the next thing is to add our database. I'm not sure we created a database in the previous class, so we can do that. Just come here, create database, and we can just make it user DB. That's fine. And save this. Good. We have user DB here. Good. And then we can just do user DB. And then the next thing we want to do is add our username and password. Definitely username, which is Postgres, and then password. We made it password. All right. The next thing is we want to add our driver class, which is because we're using Postgres, we just pass in the Postgres driver. All right, so the next thing we want to do is add something for the JPA. All right, so we want to do a JPA, and then we want to do Hibernate. Let's just auto update our database. So let's do DL and update. That's fine. One more thing we want to do is we want to look at the properties. APA dot, let's do properties. Then we want to do the Hibernate. And then what we want to do here is set the dialect. Now dialect would be org.hibernate.dialect.postgres. QL dialect. Simple. All right, so let's test this. Okay, so let's just test this. Let's look at the logs. Awesome. I think it started. Oh, we have an error somewhere. Okay, so this error is based, is for the discovery. Yeah, this is for the Eureka discovery. We can skip that for now, but the application starts, which is good, and we can also test it. So it started in what port? Let's just see quickly. Yeah, started in port 8080. So to test this, we'll go to our Postman. All right. Let's just create. Let's create a new request, HTTP request, and then of course localhost 8080. Okay, and then we want to create a body for the registration, right? We want to create a JSON body, and then what we want to do is we want to create, we want to send in our username, very important, and say our username should be test user, for example, and then our password, let's name that password 123. Okay, and then we want to do our first name. I want to send it in as John, and then we want to send our last name. And then let's just make that Doe. Okay. All right. So the endpoint we want to call is register. Right. Auth /register. Okay. And let's be sure again. If we go to our controller, we have auth then /register, which is good. Okay. So let's just try this. And then it comes back with a forbidden. Okay. So what's the error? It says we're using a get. Okay, good. So it has to be a post. All right. Good. So we have user registered successfully. Now let's just assume we want to send the same data, right? Let's just send the same data again and let's see what we have here. See? So it comes back with the user already taken. If you remember, we had the user already taken somewhere here. So if it's there, then just return the user is already taken. Good. Now let us implement our login, right? Let's just go on with our login and make sure we are able to log in and generate tokens, right? So to do that, let's just create another in the controller. Let's just create another endpoint here. Again, it's a post. Login, and then we want to just do public again. Let's return the response entity of any type, generic type, and then we do login user. Let's not name it login user or authenticate user, whatever one we want. So in this case, I will just be using a request parameter rather than a body. You see what a request parameter does. So let's just do a request param. Right, so here we want to pass in two things. First is our username, and the next one is our password. Awesome. So what do we want to do here? We just want to return response entity of okay, then we say service dot login. So it takes two parameters, which is the username, and then we take the password. Okay, so let's try this. And how do you do this? How do you test this? Let's create a new one. It's a post, right? It's a post. Let's just create a new one of post, and then of course it's going to be login. I think that's what we used yet, login. And then let's restart this. While that is restarting, we can create our. Now to create the parameters, I said this uses at request param, so it's easy to use Postman to create parameters. And what do you want to send? You want to send username, right? So let's just copy that and then username, and then if you go back from our registry, username is test user, just copy that, and then the password, and then we go back again, copy the password, and let's just try to log in and see what we get. So with a request parameter, it comes with a question mark and add the answer. Let's just try this. All right. Awesome. So if we look at it, it comes back with our JWT token. Okay, which means we are authenticated. So if you want to check the content of this JWT token, just copy it. Let's go to the browser, and then let's just go to JWT.io example, and then we can always paste it here. And if you look at it, the content of this is here. And if you remember, we already did all this job by adding all this into the claims. So this is coming from this part of the code. Let me show you the part of the code that is coming from here. The implementations. Good. So we are adding, of course, the access token is what we get back currently. And then to generate the token, here is where we are generating the token, which is the issuer, the issued at, the expired, the subject, and all those things. So that is where that job is coming from. All right. I hope that is clear. If you have any doubts or any questions or of any kind, please let me know in the comment section and we will attend to them one by one. In the next class, we'll be implementing our API gateway. All right. We're done with the authorization. We're done with the Eureka server. Now we'll be implementing the API gateway so that we see how they all work hand in hand together. Once again, I'm super thrilled to be your instructor on this journey towards building excellence. Please subscribe, leave your comments, click the notification button to stay updated with our new videos, and most importantly, share with your friends. Thank you and see you in the next video.